Parting Ways, Part 3 of 5, When the Centre of Gravity Changed and Both Sides Drew Borders. I'm Dan Jacobs. By the 40s and 50s CE, Jesus' following was still entangled with Jewish communal life. Scripture was heard inside a world of shared practice, calendar, food, synagogue habit, and inherited argument. In the following decades, the composition of the movement changed. Gentiles did not only join, they came to dominate its social world. The texts stayed Jewish and the God stayed Israel's God, but the default reader no longer experienced the Torah as a lived practice. Torah could still be honored, yet it was increasingly met through translation, citation, and dispute, rather than through the daily practice that had once made its meaning feel obvious. As the movement explained itself to a Roman world that did not share Jewish instincts, it had an inherent contradiction. It claimed an ancient inheritance, but many of the living heirs did not accept the movement's claims to Jewish inheritance. Romans respected the antiquity of a religion and distrusted new cults, so the movement had additional motivation to present itself as inheritance, not invention. That pressure didn't create anti-Jewish rhetoric, but it did reward explanations that made it easier to brush past a simple fact. Most Jews didn't accept the story. Paul's letters and the problem of later reading. The earliest Christian writings that survived were Paul's letters, written in the 50s CE into disputes that were active and specific to locales. They were interventions addressed to particular communities with particular frictions and anxieties. He reassured, he scolded, he argued, and he tried to keep groups together. Paul wrote as if time was short. He treated the turning of the nations towards Israel's God as the culmination of Israel's story. He read the story of Abraham as a template for inclusion. He asked people to make bodily decisions quickly under pressure, with the sense that history had sped up and the end was close. Later readers inherited the letters after that pressure had eased. As decades passed, the correspondence was copied, collected, and taught. What had been written as urgent guidance to stop communities splitting began to function as general instruction. Once Paul was being read mainly by Gentile churches with little lived contact with Jewish practice, his dispute language could be taken as doctrine. What began as problem solving for particular communities could become cemented into permanent rule about Torah and the law. It did not help that Paul's opponents were often described in broad strokes. The Jews, the law, works could start to mean an entire people, an entire practice world, an entire moral framework rather than the immediate opponents in view. Gentiles on the edge of synagogue life, the Gentile presence did not appear out of nowhere. Many diaspora cities already had Gentiles who hovered near Jewish life, drawn to Jewish henotheism, monotheism, ethics, and scripture. Some attended synagogue without converting. Others were close through friendships, business ties, or family links. Full conversion carried costs. Circumcision was one cost, physical and permanent. In some Greco-Roman settings, becoming a Jew could bring social penalties too. Reputational risk, complications in civic and guild life, household tension, and the experience of becoming harder to place in a world that liked clear categories. A movement that proclaimed Israel's God and Israel's Messiah, while arguing that Gentiles could belong without circumcision, offered synagogue-adjacent Gentiles a new kind of attachment. It did not require them to become Jews in order to claim Israel's story. Once that door existed and achieved a critical mass, Gentiles stopped being visitors and became the default member. That changed what felt normal, what practices were treated as optional, what arguments carried weight, and what Jewish habits started to look strange. Torah became harder to hear. For Jews, Torah was more than rules. It was scripture, memory, calendar, food, sex, relationships, purity, and the daily rituals that made Jewish life recognizable across generations. It shaped meals, rest, marriage, bodies, and blood. Even the way time itself was measured carried meaning. Once a growing Gentile majority became the norm, it became easier to speak about Jewish practice from the outside. It also became easier to treat the Jewish refusal of Christian claims as something other than a live dispute. A disagreement that could have been felt as painful and internal was recast as a defect, blindness, hardness, stubbornness. If the people closest to the scriptures did not recognize the Christian reading, it could be explained away by treating them as unreliable witnesses. It also made Torah-observant Jesus followers harder to place in the community. Their habits kept pulling the movement back towards the Jewish world it was drifting away from, and that began to look like a problem. Separation did not arrive as a single dramatic moment. It is tempting to look for a date, a council, or a formal divorce. The separation was slower and messier. Christians continued to live near Jews. They continued to borrow. They continued to be drawn to synagogue life, scripture, calendar, habits. The repeated warnings against acting like Jews suggest that plenty of Christians kept doing it. Boundaries had to be drawn and redrawn because people kept crossing them, calendar disputes. In the early rabbinic period, the Jewish court declared a new month based on observation and later calculation. Rabbi Yehoshua believed the declaration was on the wrong day. Rabban Gamliel, as head of the court, ordered Yehoshua to appear before him carrying a staff and money on the day Yehoshua believed was Yom Kippur. In Yehoshua's own view, the order required a public violation of Torah. The tradition tells this story without softening the humiliation. If different Jews followed different calendars, the split was not just technical. You ended up with 2 Yom Kippurs, 2 Passovers, people in the same group, but out of sync. Shared time created cohesion. It also created a boundary. Disputes over when to celebrate Easter and whether to anchor it to Passover or detach it into an independent festival. Had the effect of training communities away from Jewish time. The Didache, an early non-canonical Christian text often dated to the end of the 1st century CE, did not only move fast days, it framed the move as separation, telling Christians not to fast with the hypocrites, giving them different days, distinct prayers, and a shared routine that could be memorized and copied. Ignatius of Antioch, who lived around the same time, pressed this direction in a more pointed way, warning against Judaizing and urging believers to organize life around the Lord's Day rather than the Sabbath. The Didache assumed a regular gathering on the Lord's Day, with confession and a clean conscience before the communal offering, as if to build an alternative sacred center without relying on synagogue authority. Passover was one place where the Jewish calendar not only survived but deepened. The Mishnah's Passover tractate pictured a meal that was no longer only food. It became about telling a story. Children asked why this night was different. Adults replied by telling a story that moved from slavery to freedom. Rabban Gamaliel taught that Jews must name 3 symbols. The Passover offering, the matzah, and the bitter herbs aloud because saying the words made the memory communal, public, and embodied. Symbols stood in for what could no longer be experienced in the temple. Speech replaced what sacrifice used to provide. It bound a household into a peoplehood. The divergence became visible. Rabbinic Judaism drew authority into repeatable practice. Calendar, blessing law, the script of a home. The Jesus movement, spreading across cities and languages, carried authority more easily through letters, quotations, and new ways of reading scripture, feeding the split. Once mixed communities became common, meals became a battleground, divisions arose over what food was acceptable, who cooked it, whether meat from the marketplace was tangled up with pagan sacrifice. Could a Jewish believer treat an uncircumcised Gentile as a full partner at the same table without feeling a covenant boundary had been crossed? That boundary was built out of Jewish food and purity practice, the everyday rules that made it possible to live as a Jew in a pagan city without constantly slipping into its cult life. Avoiding idol-linked meals mattered. Sharing a table was one of the clearest signals of who counted as us. Paul's account in Galatians catches the problem. People eat together, then some pull back. The line is redrawn in public. Repeated friction did what no single decree had to do. It raised the cost of overlap. From the Jewish side, overlap became harder to sustain. A related movement increasingly claimed Jewish texts while recruiting Gentiles and redrawing what it meant to be part of Israel. Jews had reasons to protect cohesion, reduce confusion, and guard against heretical behavior. Repeated small decisions could create a boundary: who led prayer, who could count towards a prayer quorum, who could be trusted, who could marry whom, who remained inside for communal purposes. Taxes split groups. After 70 CE, Rome imposed the fiscus judaicus, a tax attached to Jewish status, with the money redirected to a Roman cult site that pushed the question, who counts as a Jew, beyond rabbinic argument and into civil administration. Once identity was something the state could charge for, people had incentives to report each other, deny each other, and test each other's status. In that setting, sitting in the overlap could carry practical risk, not only social awkwardness, boundaries baked into prayer. One debated marker is the Birkat HaMinim, a blessing in the Amidah, the standing prayer said 3 times a day. In later versions, it asks God to destroy minim. Minim is often understood to be referring to Christians as well as other heretics. When a boundary is built into a daily public prayer, it becomes a recurring test of belonging. Anyone who cannot say the line from the prayer, or who falters over it, is exposed in front of the entire community. No official ban is required. The people caught in the middle of the Venn diagram were the first to drop out of view. The Gentile majority did not only change relations between synagogue and church, it also changed what happened to Jewish Jesus followers. As the emerging church became culturally Gentile, Jewish believers became uncomfortable. They were living proof that the movement had been born inside Jewish life and could still look Jewish, something which could look like an embarrassment. They made it harder to say that the church had inherited Israel, while Israel itself had been set aside later. Christian writers labelled some such groups as heretical. Much of what was known about them came through opponents, filtered through caricature and contempt. The irony cut deep. The communities closest in language and habit to Jesus' own environment were among the first to be told that their way of following him did not count. Proximity to the roots did not decide the shape of orthodoxy. Numbers and institutional power did. This was also where accusations of Judaism began to arise. At first, the charge referred to particular practices. Over time, it became a general stigma, sounding too Jewish, keeping time too Jewish, eating too Jewish, taking Jewish boundaries seriously. It allowed leaders to punish boundary crossing without arguing each practice on its merits. A new kind of Jew. In the earliest setting, Jews were not an obscure part of the Jesus movement. They were family, colleagues, rivals, companions in argument. Even heated polemics still sat inside a shared social world. As the movement spread into regions where Jews were fewer or more distant, it became possible to build images of Jews that did not depend on real contact. The Jew became a figure used for internal Christian education. The one who refused, the one who misunderstood, the one who rejected, the one whose continued existence could be seen as a threat. This was also the prelude for the Against the Jews genre that followed, texts written by Christians for Christians, often in places where neither writer nor audience needed much real contact with Jews to keep the separation firm. Where this left the movement. By the end of the 1st century and into the 2nd, the Jesus movement remained saturated with Jewish scripture and Jewish categories. Yet, it was increasingly Gentile in composition and interpretation. Synagogue and church remained close enough in some places for overlap to persist, which was why leaders kept working to make the overlap less attractive. Christian leaders increasingly served as interpreters of Israel's texts for communities far from Jewish life, and the conflict shifted again. It ceased being only a dispute about the terms of Gentile inclusion. It became a contest over who had the authority to define what Judaism meant and who got to tell the story of Israel's past and Israel's future. This is where we pick up in part 4.